Today, Venice feels like a miracle. A city with no roads or cars, just boats drifting through canals and buildings that seem to float above the water. But what most people don't realize is that this city actually shouldn't exist. You see, the ground beneath Venice is soft and almost never stable. And yet, it has supported buildings and walkways for over 1,000 years. Because behind every building is an engineering system designed to defy nature itself. So what is that system? And how did early Venetians manage to build an entire city on sinking ground? To find out, we've modeled the entire city and have even brought on historians to explore how its foundations were built and the many hidden systems that have helped it survive for centuries. But before we get into those, we first need to go back to the very beginning, before a single building was ever placed in the lagoon. Long before Venice was a city, the lagoon was just an extension of the mainland. It was shallow, marshy, and filled with tiny islands, used mainly for fishing and gathering salt. The real cities were inland, so no one planned to live out in the mud. But then something changed. By the mid-400s, the Roman Empire was crumbling and cities were being attacked. And as waves of instability swept through the region, the cities that once felt permanent started to fall. One by one, inland towns were invaded, and families had no option other than to flee toward the marshy lagoon. Once a quiet resource, the lagoon became a last resort. They arrived by the thousands, settling wherever they could. It was wet, mushy, and above all, barren, but it was safe. Slowly, this fragile network of refugee outposts began to harden into something more permanent. But there was one major obstacle. The ground itself couldn't be built on. Every step sank into soaked, shifting mud. This clearly couldn't hold the weight of a building, let alone a city. So the first challenge was simple, but critical. How do you build a city that doesn't sink? So the Venetians had to come up with a new way of building. The answer lay just a few meters beneath the water. Here, a thick, stable layer of clay called Coranto was exactly what they needed. But now they had to find a way to reach it. To get there, they turned to the nearby forests. They harvested strong, straight timber trunks. Each trunk was cut to about 1 to 3 meters long and carved into a sharp point. Their idea was simple: drive timber piles deep into the ground, starting with the perimeter of the foundation and working inward until the entire surface area was covered. Then, using buckets, they'd empty the water from inside. So they got to work. Teams of workers stood in the water and used a massive tool called the attrizzatura. This 500-pound jackhammer was lifted by ropes and dropped over and over, driving the timber down through mud and silt until it struck the Coranto layer below. They repeated this until the entire perimeter was in place. But they quickly came across a problem. You see, water would seep through the gaps between the piles, defeating the entire purpose of the outside layer. So the Venetians adapted. They packed a mix of clay and silt between the perimeter piles. That locked the edges in place and kept water from seeping through. Now they could finally dry the ground and finish the timber foundation. Next came the wooden platforms. This helped spread the upcoming building's weight across the entire foundation. And finally came the Istrian stone. Slabs of dense limestone were placed on top. And this did two things. First, it gave the Venetians a strong foundation to stand on. Second, it isolated the wooden piles from the air. And without air, the wood didn't rot, allowing it to last for centuries. And this method wasn't used just once. It was repeated across 18 islands. Actually, if we were to flip the city upside down, we would find an immense forest composed of millions of piles. The next step in the process involved constructing the building. But first, they had to address a problem. You see, Venetians couldn't use traditional building methods. This is because while the foundations were strong, they were still susceptible to soil shifting. So the Venetians had to come up with a new way of building. Before they could start constructing the structures we see today, the Venetians first had to select the right building material. While their foundations were strong, they came with two major drawbacks. First, the lagoon area was susceptible to earthquakes. Second, the mud was still considered fresh, meaning if structures weighed too much, it risked excessive sinking. So the early Venetians' first solution was to build purely from timber. After all, it was readily available and strong enough to get started. But they quickly realized these buildings were extremely vulnerable to fire and could easily fall apart. So they turned to their second option, Istrian stone. But that wouldn't work either. You see, Istrian stone was too heavy and would also lead to excessive sinking. So the Venetians found themselves at a standstill. They needed something durable enough to resist fires, but also light enough to remain flexible with the shifting soil. Eventually, they decided to try brick. It was fireproof, lighter than Istrian stone, and easy to produce, so they gave it a shot. But before construction could begin, they also needed a mortar that was durable enough to last thousands of years while also being flexible enough to move with the ground. Their first choice was cement, but you see, it only checked one box. It was not flexible. So they turned to lime mortar. Unlike cement, which hardens quickly and becomes rigid, lime mortar stays somewhat flexible as it dries and cures. This flexibility helps prevent cracking when the building shifts, making it perfect for Venice. So they started building. Most construction was limited to 3 stories to keep the overall weight as low as possible. Once the main walls were in place, it was time to build the dividing floors. Traditionally, floors were made from simple timber slabs nailed together. But this crude method wouldn't hold up on Venice's shifting soil. So they had to innovate, and they did that in 2 steps. First, they laid out timber beams, as usual, but arranged them to allow for movement. Later on, around the 1500s, a thick layer of terrazzo was applied. Terrazzo is a type of mosaic flooring made from leftover marble fragments. Interestingly, however, terrazzo was heavier than other options. That seems odd, considering their goal was to reduce weight. But there's more to terrazzo than meets the eye, because it could carry more weight than it added. And when placed above wooden piles, both materials shared the load, making the entire floor much stronger than wood alone. These floors can be seen all across modern-day Venetian buildings, showing just how durable terrazzo really is. But even with smart material choices, the early Venetians still had to solve one other problem with their buildings. You see, similar to the main support walls, dividers had the same problem. If they were too rigid, they'd start to crack, or worse, pull apart from the floors entirely. So Venetian interior walls were built using 3 main components. First, vertical timber planks ran from the floor to the ceiling. These acted as the primary wall. Then, diagonal wooden braces were nailed to either side, stabilizing the structure while allowing movement. And finally, a layer of plaster was applied to smooth and seal the wall. This made the whole assembly stronger and more adaptable. That system worked well, but there was one last innovation needed to keep everything safe. Even with flexible walls and floors, buildings were still at risk of tearing apart during earthquakes or strong winds. To address this challenge, Venetian engineers installed iron tabs, metal rods that tied the walls to the floors at every level, all the way up to the attic. These rods held the structure together, allowing each part to flex without separating. You can still spot them on Venetian buildings today, especially where the outer plaster has worn away. Taken together, all these building techniques formed a structure that was extremely strong. So strong, actually, that in the city's entire 1600-year history, not a single Venetian house has ever collapsed. With building construction now mastered, structures were being built all across the Venetian islands. And unlike regular islands, which built away from one another, Venetian islands built into each other to create a more connected urban landscape. To support this growth, early Venetians relied on gondolas and horses to cross canals. But as neighborhoods merged and traffic increased, bridges were the next logical step. And one of the most important connections to make was between Rialto, the city's financial center, and St. Mark's, the religious and political heart. To link them, they had to build a bridge spanning the Grand Canal, but this would require multiple attempts. First, they built a floating wooden bridge in 1181. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, it collapsed. Then, by 1310, its replacement was set ablaze during a revolt. Later, in 1444, another wooden bridge gave way under the weight of festival crowds. Then, in 1524, the final wooden version collapsed after years of overuse. It seemed like Venice was in a never-ending cycle of build, collapse, rebuild. Clearly, something had to change. So this time, they decided to build from stone. But the decision sparked debate. Many feared it was too ambitious. Stone will never hold, critics warned. It'll sink before it's finished. Others argued it could bankrupt the city if it failed. And they had a point. Stone was rigid and heavy, and in a city built on soft, waterlogged soil, that weight could be catastrophic. So the Doge of Venice came up with a brilliant solution. We actually dug through original design records while researching this part of the story to make sure you got the best experience. And to help with that, we used a browser tool called Merlin. Merlin brings together all the top AI models in one place. So instead of jumping between different platforms, everything's right there when you need it. And yeah, it saves a lot of time and money. They're also giving you a pretty big discount, which we'll share in just a moment. You might already use AI to help rewrite emails or brainstorm ideas, but Merlin goes a step further. For us, it's been great for summarizing research papers and finding useful images fast. It's basically a great assistant built into your browser. If you want to try Merlin AI yourself, now's a good time, because most tools charge about $20 a month just for one model. But Merlin will give you access to all the major ones for only $5 a month. So, to get access to this promotion, click the link in the description and use our code CC33 at checkout or scan the QR code. Big thanks to Merlin for supporting this video. Now, back to the video. Before Pasquale Ciconia, the Doge of Venice, could go through with his brilliant solution, he first needed to clearly lay out his vision for the bridge. Here's what he had in mind. First, the workers began with wooden piles. They drove over 12,000 of them deep into the canal banks. They did not place them in one flat layer. Instead, they stacked them in 3-stepped levels, almost like stairs. This decision gave the bridge strength at different depths, so it would not slide or sink in Venice's soft mud. But they didn't just stop there. They also set the lower stone blocks at an angle, about 45 degrees, leaning inward. The thinking here was that these diagonal stones caught the outward thrust of the arch, stopping it from spreading apart. And finally, more stone blocks were placed in front and above the diagonals. These were stacked horizontally to clamp everything in place. In total, more than 10,000 tons of stone locked together as one system. Just a few years after construction began, the new Rialto Bridge opened to the public. And from there, stone bridges began popping up all across the city. Islands that once felt far apart were now just a short walk away. And by now, the city had become the most powerful and richest city in Europe. Everything being bought and sold went through Venice, and the Venetians were making enormous amounts of money. And over the years, Venice's population skyrocketed to over 170,000 people. And soon it became the most influential city in Europe. But with this new influence came a problem. Until now, Venice has relied on boats to deliver water from the mainland. But with its growing population, this model clearly wasn't sustainable. So engineers came up with a brilliant solution. To solve the city's growing water crisis, Venetian engineers built something quite ingenious: the Venetian well. These were more than just stone wellheads. Beneath each one sat a complete underground system, carefully designed to collect and filter rainwater into fresh drinking water. The first step was excavation. Crews dug wide circular basins, some stretching up to 5 meters across, and sealed the walls with thick layers of clay. This technique created a watertight container, preventing groundwater from seeping in and stored rainwater from leaking out. The next step was constructing the filtration system. At the bottom of the basin, workers laid down a bed of pebbles. In the center, they built a vertical brick shaft where the clean water would eventually collect. The rest of the space was packed with layers of fine sand. Here's how it worked. The moment it starts to rain, water flows across the square and drops into stone drains at each corner. From there, it enters the sand-filled basin below. Then the water pushes through a layer of gravel, getting filtered as it goes through. Next, it reaches the bed of pebbles at the bottom. Here, the water spreads out and flows inward, seeping through gaps until it reaches the brick shaft at the center. That's where it collects and is ready for consumption. But they didn't stop there. To maximize the surface area for water collection, they fitted the roofs of nearby buildings with gutters that would direct the water onto the square and into the drains. This was a genius invention. And now Venice became an enormous funnel, which filled more than 600 wells around the city. The Venetians had once again engineered a masterpiece to save their city. And for the next few centuries, it all worked. The foundations and structures still hold up to this day, and the main bridge still acts as the vessel of the city. All seemed good. The foundations held firm, the buildings stayed upright, and the main bridge kept the city flowing, day in, day out. In fact, for centuries, nothing really needed to change. Everything they built kept doing its job, quietly and reliably. But then came the 20th century, and with it came a new problem, one that the original builders never had to face. Venice started sinking. To help us better understand why Venice started sinking, we brought on Giovanni Cicconi, a Venetian hydraulic engineer.
If we consider in perspective, Venice has been adapting to sea level rise since 1700, because we can see the old painting of Canaletto, the view that were done with the camera obscura, that is a geometrical projection. The mean high tide is a black line that marks in the drawing of Canaletto the position in relation to the soil and the building. And if we compare the same view now with the one 300 years ago, we can find a relative sea level rise of 2 feet per century. Now we have 3 times that figure. So during the last 20 years, there has been an acceleration of 3 times.
In the mid-20th century, Venice began to pump water from under itself for industrial purposes. But what they didn't realize was that by doing this, the city would end up compacting, damaging its infrastructure.
When you remove the water from the sand, you deplete the water pressure in the clay, and the clay starts compaction. Compaction is a process that is irreversible.
And with the rise of global warming, the city is in imminent danger. So the city had to accelerate their MOSE solution. The idea for MOSE was simple. When a flood is suspected, the large platforms would be raised to an angle of around 50 degrees, resulting in an elevation difference of approximately 3 meters. And it worked. In 2022, a 5.5-foot tide was expected to flood Venetian walkways. But thanks to MOSE, pedestrians only had to deal with a little wind and rain. But there is a major flaw with MOSE.
Venice has been adapting to sea level rise slowly, but now it's impossible to get adapted. And we have the black line, the mean high tide, not the storm surge, that is constantly on the floor of the pedestrian walkway. So altogether, this problem of the MOSE being useless in 30, 50, 70 years because of the acceleration in sea level rise is a great opportunity to play now in inducing a sense of transformation and plasticity toward the anticipation of the future we like.
So the city sought a more permanent solution, and they ended up with 2 options. The first was pumping water back under the city, but there are major problems with this.
This solution was tested in some places in the United States to recover after the extraction of oil from the ground. But there is no evidence in Venice what will happen if you put the water back with pressure, because the water has to be confined. If not, you will induce a differential displacement that can crack the city monument. So it's very risky.
The second option came in what's known as a super levee. Levees are embankments built to hold back floodwaters. But in extreme floods, water can flow over the top or seep through the base, causing the levee to collapse and flood the area it was meant to protect. Super levees solve that problem by changing the shape. Instead of a narrow wall, they're wide and low with a gentle back slope. In Venice, a super levee would rise about 13 feet and stretch nearly 400 feet across the base. That wide footprint makes it resistant to overflow.
First of all, the super levee was an idea I developed after a close friendship with a Tokyo engineer, Nobuyuki Tsukiya, and they did the super levee there, just relocating the people 20 meters higher with a huge amount of sand. They started doing the super levee and they built a pretty good linear stretch. And why it's so important? Because they have behind the super levee in Eco City, the poor people is relocated in a better position. They don't lose the land, that is important. And if the tsunami comes that was unexpectedly high, and you have overtopping, the water can run behind without breaching the dike. While previously the earthquake, together with overtopping, caused very rapid breaching and flash flood with water and mud, similar to the breaching of New Orleans with Katrina. So the idea is a super levee is inherent, robust, resilient against any storm. You can get wet, but you are not killed by the storm or the tsunami.
And super levees also come with an extra benefit.
Also, the super levee is a new space for the city. Venice is encroached by gentrification and mass tourism. Whatever you don't like, you can put there, and it will be kind of an acclimation reservoir. The tourists rushing to the city will be stopped for 1 day or two in the acclimation ring, in which they will learn how to enjoy more of Venice and how to buy things that are sustainable. Because when you buy, you vote for a different model of city. That is another advantage. It will be a buffer, an ecotone, an interface, Venice with the external world. Venice is open, but is protected with the proper balance. This is the best idea of co-evolution among Venice and the rest of the world, because everyone wants to go in Venice. And this is the best compromise among Venice and nature, because nature has to have space, and Venice and the tourist has to have space, and we need the space. Also, we need the time. Adaptation is a matter of time, to learn how to adapt, learn by doing. And time is provided by the time people we spend into this buffer area.
So these levees are clearly the best solution. So why hasn't the city started constructing them?
At the moment, Venice has to maintain the MOSE. An agency has been foreseen, but not operational. So it seems the system prefer to delay any decision because the money is coming. So a good decision is not to decide anything, because if you decide, you have to cut the number of people that you are working, the money will be reduced. So it's good to maintain the program.
The MOSE barrier requires constant oversight, contracts, and maintenance, keeping entire agencies and contractors employed. A permanent fix like the super levy would wipe out that entire ecosystem overnight. It's a classic example of incentive misalignment. And the longer this drags on, the harder it gets to turn back the tide. Venice keeps sinking and the sea keeps rising. Giovanni knows that, which is why he's no longer only an engineer. He's stepped into the public eye, pushing to expose the holdups and rally support while there's still time. To learn more about Giovanni's work and access the entire interview, head over to our Patreon. You'll also get early access to upcoming videos, our exclusive Discord community, and lots of other benefits. Links in the description. And if you want to keep going, we've got another video where we break down the incredible engineering behind Roman aqueducts. Just click the thumbnail and we'll see you there.